Welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Where we tackle the sources you send our way.
Yeah, we dig in and try to pull out the core insights so you can get informed fast. Today, we're jumping into Friedrich Nietzsche.
Specifically, his ideas on power, justice, morality, based on some really interesting excerpts and analyses provided by one of you.
It's definitely challenging stuff. So the big question seems to be, how does this idea he has, the will to power, kind of change everything when it comes to concepts like right and wrong, justice, even dignity?
Exactly. And how does his view stack up against, other major philosophical traditions? It's quite a contrast.
Okay, let's start there then. Nietzsche and the will to power.
Yeah.
What exactly is that? Is it just everyone trying to grab power?
Well, it's a bit more complex than just, say, political power or dominating others, though that can be part of it.
Okay.
For Nietzsche, the will to power is more fundamental. It's this basic inherent drive within all living things, a drive to grow, overcome obstacles, expand influence, assert oneself.
So like a life force almost.
Yeah. You could think of it that way, yeah. A striving to become more. It's not just about controlling others, but also self-mastery, creativity, overcoming limitations. He sees it everywhere.
Right. So how does that fundamental drive connect to something like justice? Because, we usually picture justice as like balancing the scales, being impartial.
Yeah, and Nietzsche directly critiques that image, the balanced scales. He finds it misleading.
Oh, how so?
He prefers a different idea. Justice isn't passive balance, but an active maintaining of equilibrium between different powers. He uses the phrase tit for tat.
Tit for tat. So like an exchange?
Kind of. It implies an active process. Justice, for him, emerges from the interplay of powers trying to find a stable point, a balance. It's not some abstract ideal handed down from on high. It's worked out in the struggle.
So justice is basically a negotiation between powers.
In a sense, yes. He even argues that the concept of goodwill starts when powers realize it's mutually beneficial to respect each other's strength, to maintain that balance. That's the basis for contracts, agreements, the stuff we build society on.
Okay, this is where my head starts to spin a little. If it's all about power balance, what happens to universal moral rules? Like the idea that you just shouldn't harm people.
Yeah, Nietzsche pushes back hard against that. He rejects the idea of a universal duty not to harm, abuse, or exploit. He actually sees that kind of principle, it applied universally, as the will to negate life.
Negate life? Why?
Because for him, life is fundamentally about this will to power, this striving, overcoming, sometimes dominating. To put a universal clamp on that is, in his view, to stifle life itself, to promote decay.
Wow. So things like laws, legal systems, are they just temporary truces in this power struggle?
That's pretty much how he describes them. He calls states of legality, like our justice systems, exceptional states. They're temporary limits put on the ongoing fight between units of power.
And human rights.
He's very clear. Human rights that exist separate from these power dynamics, they do not exist.
Right.
Rights emerge from power, they don't precede it.
That's dark. It makes justice seem completely relative, dependent on who's strong and who's weak at any given moment.
Exactly. He sees justice as contingent, fluid. It has to be constantly reinterpreted based on the current power structure, the order of rank, as he calls it. What's just today might not be just tomorrow if the power balance shifts.
This really clashes with a lot of Western thought, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I'm thinking Plato, Kant. They were searching for something more permanent, right?
Absolutely. They're key counterpoints. They emphasize reason, morality, things that they believe transcend power dynamics. Plato, for instance, in The Republic.
Ah, the Ring of Gyges story, the invisibility ring.
Precisely. Plato uses that thought experiment to ask, if you could be invisible and get away with anything, would you still choose to be just? He argues, yes, you should.
Why, if there are no consequences?
Because Plato believed justice is good in itself, for the soul, regardless of reputation or reward. It's part of living a truly good life, independent of whether you look good to others.
And Kant, he talked about goodwill, right?
Yes, and for Kant, a good will is good purely because of its intention, its alignment with rational duty. It doesn't matter if you have the power to achieve your goal or even if the consequences are bad. The will itself is what counts, separate from the messy world of power struggles.
So Nietzsche would probably say they're both, I don't know, naive, ignoring the reality of power.
He's certainly deeply skeptical of abstract moralizing that doesn't acknowledge power's role. But the counter-argument from that tradition is that even if power is pervasive, asking what is justice or what is good is still valuable.
Why? if it doesn't change the power dynamics?
Because it helps us orient ourselves. Like the philosopher Nicholas Riescher said, we need ideas to give us direction. Thinking about ideals, even if they're hard to achieve, helps us shape our own lives and understand our place beyond just reacting to immediate pressures. It's like having a map, even if the territory is rough.
Okay. Now, Nietzsche also talks a lot about nihilism. He seemed worried about it.
Very much so. He saw nihilism as the almost inevitable consequence of the decline of traditional values, especially Christian morality.
What did he mean by nihilism exactly? Just despair?
It's deeper than just sadness. It's the realization or the belief that the highest values we've held, meaning, purpose, objective truth, are actually baseless. That the universe doesn't inherently possess the meaning we've tried to impose on it. This leads to a feeling that everything is in vain.
Like the rug's been pulled out from under everything.
Exactly. It's a state where things lose their value. He saw it as a transitional phase, maybe stemming from weakness or decadence, where old values collapse before new ones can be created. He even called the claim, "there is no truth," a form of nihilism.
And this connects to his famous phrase, God is dead.
Yes. For Nietzsche, the death of God symbolized the collapse of belief in that overarching Christian moral framework that had underpinned Western culture. Without that foundation, the traditional source of ultimate value and meaning disappears, leading towards this nihilistic void.
He also links this to decadence. What's that about? Is it just moral decline?
Not just moral. He often frames decadence in physiological terms, a kind of decline in vitality, strength, health. He argued that this underlying physiological state influences our values.
So weakness leads to certain kinds of values.
That's his argument. He suggests things we see as causes of decline, like maybe vice or weakness of will, are actually consequences of an underlying physiological decadence.
So decadence comes first, then nihilism follows.
Yes, he sees nihilism as a logical result of decadence. And this is why he was so critical of traditional morality's attempts to just fight vice. He thought they were naive, treating symptoms without understanding the root physiological condition as he saw it.
Which brings us back to his overall critique of morality and philosophy. He wasn't a fan, was he?
Not of the traditional kinds, no. He saw much of conventional morality as a will to negate life, born out of weakness. He famously argued that morality was often a tool of the powerless to condemn the strengths of the powerful, flipping natural values on their head.
Like making strength seem bad and meekness seem good.
Precisely. He was even suspicious of the drive for truthfulness itself, suggesting it could mask other motives, maybe even a fear of facing uncomfortable realities.
And he thought philosophers were basically just moralists in disguise.
Often, yes. He accused many philosophers like Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer of building systems that ultimately served a pre-existing moral agenda, rather than being purely objective inquiries. And of course, he completely rejected the idea of free will, seeing it as a theological trick to make people feel responsible and punishable.
This must tie into his rejection of the whole true world versus apparent world idea we see in Plato and others.
Absolutely. He saw the concept of a hidden, perfect, true world behind our flawed, apparent world as a major philosophical and religious error, a crutch that was no longer useful.
So for Nietzsche, there's just this world,
Yeah.
the one we experience.
Yes, and our understanding of it is shaped by our interpretations. And these interpretations aren't about finding the one truth, but are driven by the will to power interpretations that help us survive, grow, and assert ourselves. He even suggested the will to truth itself is a form of the will to power.
Okay, so traditional values are collapsing, and it's all about interpretation of power. Where did he think humanity was headed? He talks about an order of rank.
Right. He envisioned society, or perhaps humanity's future, being structured according to an order of rank based not on birth or wealth necessarily, but on the quantum of power. Individuals possess their strength, creativity, self-mastery.
That sounds hierarchical.
Yeah.
Elitist, even.
It definitely is. He was highly critical of democracy, universal suffrage, anything he saw as promoting mediocrity. He spoke of needing a new doctrine to act as a breeding agent, essentially to cultivate stronger, more powerful individuals and weed out the world-weary.
Wow. What did that look like in his vision?
He had these sometimes quite distorting visions of a future master race, potentially arising from new international unions, led by what he called philosophical men of power and artist tyrants. The goal wasn't to make people better, in a moral sense, but to create conditions that forced strength, discipline, both physical and spiritual.
That's intense. And then there's maybe his most famous or infamous idea, the eternal recurrence.
Ah, yes, the eternal return. He called it his most abysmal thought, but also a potentially triumphant one.
What is it exactly that everything just repeats?
Literally everything. Every single moment of your life, every joy, every pain, every thought, every mundane detail, repeated infinitely in exactly the same sequence, forever.
Oh, man. That's a lot to take in. Why? What's the purpose of thinking that?
Well, he saw it as a kind of ultimate test, a selective principle. How would you react if you knew this life, exactly as it is, was all you'd ever get, repeated eternally?
I guess you'd want to make sure it was a life you could stand repeating.
Precisely. It's a call to affirm life, this life, unconditionally. To live in such a way that you could say yes to its eternal repetition. It ties into his revaluation of all values, finding meaning and strength not in some other world or afterlife, but right here, embracing the will to power and the eternal cycle of existence. He pictured the universe as this monster of energy, constantly transforming but always returning.
So, wrapping this up,
Yeah.
we have Nietzsche basically saying power underlies everything. Ethics, justice, it's all dynamic, all about struggle and overcoming.
Right, which is a direct challenge to traditions like Plato's or Kant's that look for justice and morality in reason, in universal principles that stand apart from power.
In his critique of morality, his ideas about nihilism, decadence, this future order of rank, and the eternal return, it's certainly provocative. It forces you to question a lot.
Definitely. His ideas remain incredibly influential, partly because they're so challenging, so unsettling. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions about where our values really come from and what it means to live a meaningful life in a world maybe stripped of its old certainties.
Which leaves us with a big question, especially thinking about why our listeners sent these sources in. Considering Nietzsche's relentless focus on power, how do you, listening now, square that with your own sense of justice and morality? What happens if you accept his ideas about the will to power? Or if you reject them?
Yeah, what are the implications for how you see the world and your place in it? A lot to chew on.
Definitely. And that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.